Also. Now, it's a great pleasure to me to present you, or to introduce you to Nikos Papastergiadis. He is one of the most renowned cultural theorists that in the world, certainly, and cultural theory as a scientific field is, of course, a field that is very dear to my own field, curatorial studies, and sometimes I actually very much miss, or feel a lack of cultural methods or ideas and perspectives of cultural theory also, or cultural theory also within our school. So this is one of the reasons why I'm really happy that Nikos came here for our symposium. Nikos Papastergiadis is director of the research unit in public cultures and professor at the School of Culture and Communication at the University of Melbourne. And his research is at the moment focusing on the historical transformation of contemporary art and cultural institutions by digital technology, which is an important topic also for us. But Nikos Papastergiadis is also renowned for his extensive research on the subject of migration and postcolonialism, and for publications such as Modernity as Exile, Dialogues in Diaspora, The Turbulence of Migration. And then there are, of course, also other iconic works like Metaphor Intention, Spatial Aesthetics, and the Cosmopolitanism and Culture. He's at the moment he's also regularly contributing to the magazine South as a State of Mind, published in the foreground of Documenta 14. And the term South of a State as a State of Mind is actually a term that is coined by Papastergiadis himself, and it's, I think, it's like the route that the Documenta 14 is going to develop out. So his definition of South as the culture, it goes back to his idea or definition of the South as a cultural modality and as a regional optic, or on what I call spherical consciousness, like it's a spherical, a space consciousness that can move maybe also, we'll see. And by describing the South not as a place in the world, it is a space where people meet to imagine the possibility of other ways of being in the world. And it is, in this sense, also a little public sphere. It is where strangers encounter each other and through dialogue produce some form of exchange and mutual understanding. So here he is also opening up a potential space for Documenta 14, and we are all looking forward to see which dimensions the curators and artists involved in this Documenta will develop this space into in the run of the coming year. Also, with respect to the crisis of democracy, which we are facing in many places of the West at the moment. So today, Nikos Papastergiadis will maybe focus more on the North and the actual ways of reacting to the crisis, which are also relevant on how we develop the potential spaces of our own university.
Thank you very much, Anya. That was very kind of you and very generous of you to make that link to Documenta. Not sure that Documenta will fully recognize the history that you've outlined, which I think is interesting, but
I guess we have to wait for the computer.
Yes, and there's no hurry about that. Yeah, you can work on that. I also would like to take this opportunity to thank Siegfried and also Ali, who has been, both of them who have been so vivacious and so considerate in welcoming me and many other people to this symposium and conference. So it's been a real honour to be here, and I've learnt a lot already, and I'm looking forward to the rest of today as well. So what I want to do today is, in a sense, talk about the context in which an art school or university operates, the context of sociality. And I'm going to take a slightly strange route, talk a little bit about our present, which, as we all know, is continuously finding new low lows. Drones over the Aegean hotspots, walls between the US and Mexican border, camps in the Pacific, containers on the Hungarian-Serbian borders. How low can we go? But also we'll then root this discussion into thinking about philosophical permission, to use Uritz's term, that enables these new low lows. But first let me give a few examples which go in the opposite direction. In 2016, I was invited to write a book on this Confederation of 6 museums, L'Internazionale. The Confederation, which brings together these 6 museums, is an opportunity to share resources, personnel, archives, programs, and to develop activities, events, programs through collaboration and cooperation across Europe. It's a democratic spirit that engages with the issues of diversity and sees how ideas emerge through the collective experience of difference. Even at a most preliminary glance, one gets the sense that this project is probably one of the most idealistic and expansive experiments in the history of museums. And it's leading towards a new thinking about the relationship to publics, the public not as a receiver of ideas, but as a shaper of activity and experience, and therefore the public as a constituent, and the museum as a constituent space. Midway through this year, I will also be completing a 5-year research project on the relationship between multiculturalism and governance in Australia. In this team-based research project, we've traced artistic careers, looked at local communities, how they've developed transnational links, undertaken extensive observation activities in little festivals and events that occur in the peri-urban areas of Melbourne. And we've seen, again, another sequence of experiments in conviviality, very transversal practices. And we've discovered, against the grain of the political discourses of these new low lows, that in fact at the local level we see diversification in both cultural production and the location for cultural experience. We've seen that migrant communities are more likely than the host communities to engage in community and charitable works. We've found that the idea of belonging is not something that comes more readily to these communities, but the desire to fit in is more accentuated. And that while these communities are increasingly moving away from the national institutional, political and cultural formations, they are also pioneering new forms of transnational cultural exchange and public interaction. So these findings correlate quite well with many other findings in the UK, which have also identified the way in which migrant communities are producing these new hybrid and defying the stereotypes that they're meant to be these rigid, closed, static ethnic ghettos. But what we see, therefore, is both with these grand experiments like L'Internazionale and these small events in the peri-urban areas of metropolitan cities, is experiments in conviviality. Now, we can sentimentalize about these ideas of conviviality, or we can go deeper. So what I hope to do today is to actually connect this idea of conviviality to what one of the directors of L'Internationale called a compulsion for ruthless pragmatism. And also to show how these pragmatic decisions are palpable examples of curiosity, of wonder, desire that occur in multicultural everyday scenes. So my concern is therefore not to debunk power by exposing its own contradictions, but to, in a way, elaborate on the work of the imagination and how art manifests itself through the affective experience of the encounter with the other. And in this process, I hope to overcome that debilitating and ultimately destructive polarity between the normative and the aesthetic, in order to show how both institutions like museums, which have undergone all sorts of institutional critique, which were in a sense a normative realignment process, and how these cultural events in the peri-urban areas are both ultimately attempts to activate this affective encounter with the other. So that the transformative experience doesn't come from the top down, but comes from the curiosity in other activities, the desirous glance in another person, and even in the flirtatious behavior between young people. Saw plenty of examples of that. Now, I also hope that this presentation that I'm going to give today is undertaken in the spirit of the last two presentations. Kamal suggested that at night the city leaves its present. And we just saw a virtual and real Skype encounter. Right now in Melbourne, it's just about midnight. I am here physically, but in a sense, I hope you also receive me in the spirit of midnight, so that we are also in the process of leaving our present. And it's in that spirit that I also hope that we'll seek to overcome some of the more negative stereotypes and structures for thinking about difference in culture. So, like I said, my aim is not to expose the contradictions of power, but I do want to explore now how philosophy, in one sense, has, to an extent, not all strands, but one very powerful tradition in philosophy, has tried to reduce and control the question of mobility, difference, and affect, and impose a kind of regulative force on the questions of mobilities that we're increasingly experiencing today, which we've seen how the political masters have responded to the questions of mobility. They've all in Europe, whether it's Angela Merkel or the French or British prime ministers, have all renounced and rejected and disavowed the multicultural experiment and as an absolute failure. Similarly, in Australia, our political elite have poured scorn on these cultural experiments. And what I'm going to suggest is that at the local level, there's a completely different lived world. And what I'm going to suggest, however, is that this political discourse, which looks outwardly rather than inwardly at its own community activities, looks outwardly at a world of competition and security, and therefore conflates the consequences and processes of mobility with the issues of global catastrophe. I want to suggest that, in fact, this political discourse is not separate from one particular strand of philosophical thinking. And to elaborate on that, I'll be, and no disrespect is intended here, looking at the work of the former rector of this university, Peter Sloterdijk. Peter Sloterdijk is someone who has been incredibly influential to my thinking, but I admire his Diogenes-like thinking. He's so contrarian, he's full of great imaginative leaps, he's one of the most sophisticated and scholarly thinkers, he's truly an erudite person, but he's also a polemicist and a contributor to these debates in a way that I believe affirms what I call the invasion complex. Now, how does he do this? First of all, he does this by making a comment, a series of complaints and criticisms of how our society and our condition is going through change. And most of his observations are full of not just half-truths. They're pretty close to being accurate diagnoses. But let me go through some of them and show you how they also confirm to what I call the invasion complex. He basically sees globalization as his big target. And this is the mechanism that is causing this unrest and destabilization that we must resist and overcome. And globalization is a problem for him because of two reasons. And I'll unpack the steps that he takes in both of these reasons. The first one is because of the deculturation of society that globalization brings. Globalization deculturalizes society because it strips it of its own values, its own idea system, its own ways of identification and processes for attachment. By putting forward foreign ideas and constantly celebrating the new, the novel, the different, it undermines the capacity for any society to hold on to what it considers dear, real, and embedded in its society. Now, that is not unfamiliar. The McDonaldization thesis in sociology has been describing this phenomenon for decades. But what is distinctive about this interpretation of our current condition through the process of deculturation is the way in which it presumes that culture can only exist, can only take its form if it's fully embedded in a locale, in a specific place. And therefore that our only attachment to values and thinking and connection and solidarity with others occurs within this sphere of the cultural attachment. So that's the first claim. Then the moment you assume that territory and culture are linked to each other, then he makes the claim that this is the first order of our experience of the world. This is what comes first. So that the constitutive force of mobility is in reaction to the primary desire to produce closure. And so in a sense, while Sloterdijk is one of the most interesting writers and thinkers about mobility, he confines it to how it can occur within the condition of a space. So in a sense, mobility for him is not across territories, but within an enclosed sphere. So in a sense, mobility for him is vertical, not horizontal. As a consequence, he has all sorts of disparaging comments to make about the ideas of multiculturalism, about cosmopolitanism, as just provincialism on its tours. But ultimately, he's saying that any sense of culture has to be defined by a guarding of a territory, and that one must jealously guard it from any kind of invasive forces, any other kinds of external elements. Because the analogy between culture is not just a spherical one, but it's also the skin of a body. So the analogy to cultural formation is also the integrity of the skin of a body repelling and being resistant to, or being able to be inoculated from and therefore immune to the invasive force of external elements that enter your body. And so a vital system, a vital cultural system, will be at best able to endure the invasive force because it's already inoculated against it. So anything that's foreign that goes into its body is absorbed without having to have changed its sovereignty. Whereas a weak system, and you think increasingly Europe is a weak system, is one which opens itself to the other, opens itself to these foreign forces, and then ultimately fragments because it can't resist and repel, and it can't eliminate or deport the foreign forces. So ultimately this organization of culture is about how you either include by eliminating and subordinating the foreign, that's his model of hospitality, it's confined to that, or by converting and expelling and destroying the foreign. So there are the 5 steps that are critical to Sloterdijk's understanding of the risk of deculturation in an age of globalization. But underpinning these 5 steps is also a process of the desubjectification of the stranger. Because who is this invasive force? What is it? It's of course someone. Someone like me who leaves Australia with an Australian passport and enters Germany with a Greek passport. Another kind of horizontal invader. Because the stranger is simply someone who's outside the sphere of that culture. And what the stranger can do is cause a wound, because you literally pierce the sphere. You cut the skin by entering into this body. And the aim, therefore, of a culture is to, in order to repel this stranger, is to avert wounds, because the narcissistic force of any culture is to preserve itself, to have a system of homeostasis, says Sloterdijk. So the aim is therefore to keep you and your culture at one with itself. And so any kind of invasion is seen as a risk to your narcissistic self-order. And so he proposes that if our principle of survival and cultural retention is this, under this condition of the narcissistic order, then one's interest in the other and one's engagement with the foreigner is always finite, unless the stranger will perform into roles that are already prescribed for them by the internal group, then they must be repelled. They must be expelled. And that the natural instinct, I use that inverted commas, towards the stranger is of hate. There's a presumption that the outsider, the stranger, is a risk and must be averted and hated, and because Sloterdijk claims there is what he calls a finite interest in difference, and that affection only happens within the sphere and within face-to-face and close relations, whereas disaffection and distrust multiplies the further and further you get with others. So ultimately, what Sloterdijk is saying is not only the desubjectification of the stranger, that they have no subjectivity, no quality, no right to dialogue and communal, but that ultimately all people who live inside a culture have no sense of world fellowship. They could not possibly genuinely be interested in all the world. All they could genuinely be interested is those within their sphere. World fellowship to him is a nice philosophical abstraction which the ancient Greeks and maybe thought about in a sophisticated way, but it is not tenable and it's not part of our human nature, effectively argues. And that this normative idea that we have learnt is only something that comes after in our social experience, because what's primary is this limited interest in the world, in others, and the beast which needs to be tamed inside us. And he says for thousands of years philosophy tried to tame that beast through good reading, humanist discourse, the whole idea of the Enlightenment, but this is a failed experiment in his mind, and that in fact we have to accept that what is primary is our hate for others and our care for ourselves. These are strong words and strong arguments. And of course, we could spend quite a bit of time showing that the Sloterdijk of some parts of his work is not the same as the Sloterdijk of the other parts of his work. There's a lot of Sloterdijk that talks about the benefits of polytheistic, the benefits of multiple thinking, the benefits of non-binary thinking, and the failure of metaphysics, and the failure of a unitary ontology, and the failures of binary codes for all the antagonisms that monotheistic and other kinds of work have produced. And he's basically argued in some parts that in fact all cultural systems can only be understood in a multivalent world, right? So that in a sense you could say this is completely inconsistent with his other analysis of culture as a hybrid process. He recognizes that once information produces a feedback, the external and the internal are ultimately reconfigured, and that cannot be analysed in the binary discourse that I've just presented you with. Similarly, this idea of the primary order of misanthropy is in no way justifiable or explicable unless, of course, you assume that our other affective conditions, curiosity, care, wonder, love, desire, are somehow secondary to the primary condition of hate. Now, there's no evidence in any of Sloterdijk's work. In fact, there's a lot of evidence that shows that these other affects are in fact as equivalent, if not parallel to, in constitutive power. So we could play this game of saying, hey, Sloterdijk, in other parts of your work, you've contradicted what you've said in this part of your work. But I'm not interested in that. I don't want to redeem him by appealing to the better half of himself. What I would rather do is embark on a sort of slight examination of his ultimate mentor, which is Heidegger. I'm no Heideggerian expert, but I will just work through the way in which he works through Heidegger's work in order to show you how he's also been struggling with this tension between mobility and the house. Because he sees in Heidegger as the primary thinker of kinesis, ontokinesis, he argues. But he also sees in Heidegger that here is someone who never left home, in a sense. Heidegger, for him, is the ultimate provincial person who, by staying in his village, never wanting to go to the rest of the world, was perhaps providing a different kind of truth to what the cosmopolitans were proposing. And he sort of admires this sort of provincialism, this rootedness in Heidegger's thinking, as if this was some kind of Zen achievement. But what I think is more interesting is the tension that it's produced between the relationship between philosophy and the city. The appeal to the countryside as a way of thinking about thought, and the role of the city as a place of the many and a place for philosophy and the polis. And what he sees in Heidegger is a way to break that connection between philosophy and the city and the many, and the return to thinking about the place from which thinking comes as a solitary place and a singular place, perhaps. And in this, I think there is this tension between philosophy and the demos, the people. And this tension has played itself out all throughout time, because we know that philosophy, if we look at it, has always, at the in ancient Greek, philosophy has always had this tension with democracy. Philosophers like Plato preferred to be the good guide to the tyrant than to be immersed with the people. And as a consequence, they saw the people, the poli, the multiples, and the polis as a source of folly, fantasy, not the source of wisdom. In fact, wisdom was vertical subjectivity as opposed to the concatenation of ideas through the coming together of the people that the agora gives us. So, let's start with this image of the agora, the ancient Greek city center area and its multitude of civic spaces. And in fact, the agora was this place for the coming together of people and the concatenation of ideas in that moment of encounter. And of course, it had these, not only the temples, but also the circular roundhouse, which was the Voleftirion, and the Tholos, which is the places of deliberation. Now, interestingly enough, what Sloterdijk is effectively asking us to do is to turn away from these kinds of sites, and he looks back into the relationship between Plato and Heidegger as a way of reclaiming elements in the relationship to place. Now, he sees two key traumas in ancient Greek philosophy, one of which was Plato's own failure to develop a political engagement with a tyrant in Syracusa, a Greek colony in Sicily, and his return home after this failed expedition, which led to him building the academy. The academy, as this map shows you, was, see that on that, to the academy, in that top left-hand corner, is the road that leads you to a place. The academy was a park just outside the city walls of the center of Athens. It was not in the city of Athens. He built his academy just outside, and the academy had its own structure, it had a bucolic setting, and we can still see it today. It still exists just outside the center of Athens, and interestingly enough, we see how, in fact, the academy was the place for instruction. And Sloterdijk argues that it was a mode of instruction that also produced its own spheres of enchantment. So, we're here at a university. We're here in academies. In many ways, we are still inside Plato's academy. Inside Plato's academy, there were private cells for learning, there was a library, and there was a lecture theatre. And the hierarchy was not dissimilar to the hierarchy we have today at universities. The head of the school spoke, as I am to you now, hence being the head that speaks. In the audience, people like yourselves were the lectors who recorded. I do the real thing, you do the writing down, hence this whole thing about logocentrism that Derrida does very well. But then there's this intermediary figure called the reader, which I was always confused about, because in British universities, and at one stage I was, you went from lecturer to reader before you became a professor or a head. And the reader was the person who gathered all the texts produced by the lectors and then read it back to the head. Right? This is the enchantment of instruction. And of course there was a degree of eros here, but nevertheless it produced a hierarchy of the relationships that Derrida has unpacked. But what I want to pick up on the fact is that the degree of melancholy and ambivalence that Sloterdijk has in Plato's own account of the academy, because he says Plato both saved and betrayed philosophy by building the academy. Saved it from what? Saved it from the surveillance and the risks of the peripatetic encounters of his mentor and father figure, Socrates. Saved it from the everyday encounter of philosophy with everyday life and the risks of political backlash. Saved it, but also betrayed it by creating a space of exemption, a space of detachment from the city. Hence I pointed out to you that it was outside of the city, in a park. Now, Sloterdijk sees this moment as both sort of this ambivalence in this moment of founding of the academy and its continuities to the present. But what he doesn't talk about is another line that philosophy also had and developed in Athens within a century after the founding of the academy. This other line can be found in the Stoa. A Stoa was the arcades, and here are an example of these reconstructions of the arcades that were adjacent to the agora. In the Stoa, there's one particular Stoa, it's called Stoa Pikili, the multicolored Stoa, where a lot of paintings and sculptures were hung, is where a Cypriot Syrian philosopher called Zeno paraded and discoursed and encountered others and presented his thinking on a daily basis. Adjacent to the city centre, not outside, slightly above, not enclosed, in this liminal space that was within the walls of the city centre, the first cosmopolitan thinkers articulated a vision of radical equality amongst people, a vision that whether you're man or woman, rich or poor, Greek or not Greek, everyone has the equal potential to become wise, to become attuned to the cosmos, to be a sage. Now, in this open interactive environment, in this peripatetic mode, in this hustling and bustling atmosphere, we see a new and different line of philosophy. One that was also, as Sloterdijk doesn't mention this, but as a counterpoint to the space of the theatre. The theatre, as we know, was a place of performance, but as Plato feared, was also a rivalry for the control of the imagination, a source of rivalry and competition for how we control and organize the work of logic and reason and affect and imagination. And what Sloterdijk sees is that the theatre at this point, and he makes a very, very interesting observation, is that the theatre was in the past only enabled to perform plays once. But at the time of the founding of the Academy, the theatre was given permission to repeat the classics, already the classics of Sophocles, Euripides. And so this repetition and this enablement to put on again a play meant that for the first time, theatre could have a kind of mass and popular and ongoing role in shaping the imagination. So he sees these as the rival points to the ways in which philosophy could set itself up as the kind of master position within the regulation of the city. Now, what I think Sloterdijk does in reconnecting ancient Greece to Martin Heidegger's work is try to overcome this fundamental tension between this idea of mobility and being housed, being contained within the sphere. And he tries to sort of show how cosmopolitanism is an ultimate failure because it cannot be extended to anyone and to everywhere, but must be confined to your people from here. To me, this is a false, not only a false logical extension, but it's an abrogation of everything that the Stoics, in fact, demonstrated and developed. And it's an abrogation and it's a break between the way in which the people and knowledge can produce each other through their encounters. In a sense, what we see in Sloterdijk's reclamation of the place is in fact an ancient tension between the oligarchs and the democrats. Because the place of assembly was not just the theatre, but was also this other place just outside of the agora called the Pnika, which is the place of assembly. The Pnika, as we see here, was an open space that could hold about 10,000 people where ideas were debated, where the city came together to debate and discuss its problems and solutions. As you see from this image, there's a slight stage where the speakers would get in the middle, where would stand and present their ideas to the public that would then go to a vote. That's called the Vima, the step. Now, when the oligarchs were in power, the Vima faced the mountain behind Athens. When the Democrats were in power, the Vima was turned around to face the sea. One was inward, the other one was outward. And what I believe, what we see in this slight shift in terms of the location of the Vima was a difference in orientation. And this, I think, also comes back to the difference between one's relationship to place and territory and culture. The interesting thing about the Stoics is not only that they walked up and down this arcade, they had this inside-outside, slightly above but inside, but adjacent experience of the city, is that like Zeno, who was from Cyprus, originally from Syria, every other member of the Stoics, and about 30 or 40 of them we know, were foreigners. Not one Stoic philosopher that we know about from this early period was from Athens. They were all foreigners. And this is an interesting thing about these outward-looking outsiders who came to Athens and were the first genuine thinkers of cosmopolitanism. And this is also interesting to Sloterdijk in a way, because there's a part of him who also feels that Heidegger overlooked this outward capacity that humans have. And for him, one of the fascinating elements in human history is this, what he calls this Adventist spirit, this capacity for humans to go outwards. And he himself admits that he has no capacity to define this characteristic, but at the same time sees it as the limitation inside Heidegger's own struggle between place and mobility. But I think this outward-facing idea is not the only limitation in Heidegger's thinking that in a sense, Sloterdijk reenacts. The deeper struggle in Heidegger, and that is replayed by Sloterdijk, is the struggle with the people, the demos. The struggle with the denizens, the citizens, the metics, the strangers, the locals, and this constant interaction. Now, there is no concept of the horizontal for travel in Heidegger, according to Sloterdijk. But it's not because there's a problem with difference in horizontality, it's because there's no concept of the demos either. With no demos, the people of the multitude, the many, the poli of the polis, then there is no need for a horizontality of difference. And with no demos, there's no need for wisdom as the concatenation of thinking that comes into being through the encounter with the other. So I'm saying that wisdom and thinking in the academy is not just a retreat into your cell, and then the synthesis of those retreats into the product that the reader then gives back to the head of school. But rather, the moment of thinking is in this encounter that we've heard discussed quite a bit in the last couple of days, the encounter with the other that constitutes the public. And so the point of this is to open up, again, the desire and affective manifestations that occur through these encounters. So what I hope we've tried to demonstrate is that, in fact, conviviality is not just a sentiment that inspires experiments like L'Internazionale, or is at the basis of events in public activities and communities on the peri-urban areas of metropolitan cities, but that conviviality is fundamental to our thinking. Conviviality is the concatenation of thinking through the coming together with others. Now, what Sloterdijk was in a sense fighting against is this failure of humanism to tame the beast, right? And to convert the sort of peasants into bourgeois citizens, to turn us into good people of good conduct, this is a great phrase that we heard from Irit's talk the other day when, you know, we're all being trained into good practice. We're all being monitored, measured, mentored, consulted, etc., so that we achieve good practice. But good practice into what? We aren't developing good practice so that we become better citizens, so that we believe and commit ourselves more fulsomely to integrating into the civic spaces and national categories. We're certainly not performing good practice in order to feel the affinities and attunements of the cosmic order of the ancient world. There's no sense of good practice having a harmony with the spheres. Good practice is just an insurance policy. It's just an activity to demonstrate compliance so that you are insurable, so that you don't fall out into that space where anything can happen to you. But conviviality doesn't rest on insurance contracts. Conviviality comes from something else. It's spread in museums, it's spread in public events through this non-coercive kind of activity of attraction to the other, and in the creativity that is also bestial but also desirous and wondrous and caring. And on that, I would like to say thanks.
Thank you.
Shall we sit down? Yep.
Thank you very much for your talk. In my personal view, I found it quite liberating because, like in the last year, we discussed, or in many places within the university, we certainly discussed, especially the link of Sloterdijk's interventions in public discourse and the link to Heidegger. But what didn't happen until now is that we discussed it in a public situation. So I'm very, very happy that you just started it. Maybe in this case, as I think many of us might have their personal thoughts about this discourse, maybe in this case I would really ask if there are already questions. They are all scared. Everyone is scared. Yeah. Yeah.
Can you refer to your practice in Athens? Like, how's that? How you managed to build that space of encounter of different relations and so many people from different scenes and perspectives in Athens, like just bringing your concepts you just introduced us to in a real life situation?
I live in Melbourne, Australia. Okay. And
well, it's just
it's on now. Yes. Okay. I live in Melbourne, Australia, and my work is at a university, not in an art school. I used to be in an art school where I tried to pioneer a whole practice of collaboration and contextual thinking across disciplines. I've undertaken a lot of research and also commissioned projects and conduct public events whereby these principles are put into practice. I'll give you one brief, I could talk about the multicultural ones about it in public spaces, but I'll give you one brief example of another kind of scenario where we've tried to do this. I recently completed a book which documents a 5-year project called Ambient Screens, A Transnational Public Sphere, in which we realized that people conduct themselves with these encounters with strangers, not just face-to-face, but virtually. And what we found in our research was that people's sense of community was not just their locale, but also like extended diasporas around the world. And this often is experienced very privately, but sometimes publicly as well. And we wanted to activate and visualize these public transnational communities, sometimes diasporic groups, communicating with each other by Skype or developing networks of exchange through festivals, or just simply having distribution systems so that their cultural productions in one place are immediately disseminated across the world. Now, what we wanted to do was to also do this not just one-to-one or through virtual means, but also in a public space. So I had this idea of utilizing the large screens in public spaces. You know, the large screens like this that occur. We have a beautiful one in the centre of Melbourne called Federation Square. It's the big civic space. And so I built this relationship with an equivalent space in Korea, and we suggested, what would it be like if a screen in Melbourne was linked telematically with a screen in Korea, in Seoul, so that the content of both screens was the same, but not only the same, but that the content of each screen would be simultaneously affected by people's mobile phone. Through your mobile phone, you could send a message that would affect the content of the screen. And so that somebody looking at a screen in Seoul would send a message to that screen, which would also change the appearance of the screen in Melbourne in real time. And we commissioned 5 projects where artists, through performance, through dance, through poetry, through biographical details, could engage the public in both places simultaneously, but also create a sense of community across these differences and distances. So that, in a sense, what we saw happening was a kind of learning and exchange occurring through the exchange of gestures, through exchange of information, through the change of words that occurred across these screens. So this was a very brief example of the capacity that humans have to be interested in others across vast distances, and that how the bridging effect of communication not only reminded each other of our distances, but also, as one of the Koreans said, if only communication and screens was at a level of resolution where when I look into the screen, I can really see your eyes. Now, I can't even see your eyes from this distance, but it's interesting that when someone from Korea says that about someone in Melbourne and they're 12,000 miles away and looking at each other on a large screen. So what I'm trying to suggest through these examples is that these ideas of interest in others are not abstractions, but are real. And so these aren't second-order activities that we do because we're directed to do them by good philosophers, or that they come to us by political mandate, but rather they come from us, they come to us and through us, through our own curiosity, care and compassion towards others.
Ja, Herr Belting war zuerst, aber ich, ja okay, wir machen das mal anders. Herr Belting.
Nikos, my congratulations first for this highly illuminating lecture, which was illuminating on many levels, but also for me very interesting is the level of ancient Greece, the tensions which you described between the one and the other, that they both existed. And my question is directed to this sphere. Could it be that Plato's disrespect and distrust of writing was part of this same situation? That he said, writing cannot answer you. It is there and you have to read it and that's all. Yeah. But if you speak to a live person, he needs to answer you.
Yeah.
And therefore, he forged his writings as dialogues.
That's right.
In order to convey the impression that there was a discussion going on between equal partners. That's the question.
No, you're absolutely correct. I mean, there's this unresolved ambivalence between what he did and what he believed in. And in a sense, I think this is where I really admire Sloterdijk. He's very perceptive. When he says that Plato both saved and betrayed philosophy by producing these dialogues, because his mentor, Socrates, never wrote a word, right? He walked into the city. He engaged in public life. He encountered strangers. Socrates was an enormously interesting character in many sense. He was, in a sense, quite anarchic. Not as anarchic as Diogenes, who I know Sloterdijk also admires, right? And not as anarchic as Zeno, perhaps, who also believed in a higher level of radical equality. But there was this sort of this power of the lived experience in Socrates. Now, the division between writing and speaking, as you rightly point out, was something that could not be reconciled in Plato, but he could fake it in a sense, and he performed it incredibly beautifully. His dialogues are great works of art. You know, in terms of rhetorical power, they are brilliant. But at the same time, they also perform a tension, as you rightly point out, which is constitutive to the way in which philosophy then turns its back to the city and turns away from the people and turns it turns itself into a vertical dive rather than a horizontal engagement with the other.
Now, Siegfried Zielinski had a question, and then also Rödiger.
Thank you very much, Nikos. Looking at the various concepts of Greek Academy, Epicurus is for me the most interesting one, because it's perhaps the most open one, and the one which is very, very strongly opened to sensitivity and sensual experience and so on. But this is another question. These competing concepts of different academies going back to ancient Greece can be perhaps the subject of another symposium. What I wanted to ask, and this is a slight irritation, especially because you are coming from Australia, your analysis and your description, your interpretation sticks, I put it a little bit provocative, sticks very much to the idea of territorium. The main thinker of cosmopolitanism, as we know, was not Heidegger, of course, it was Kant, and he didn't even leave his Königsberg further away than 30 kilometers or something like that. A thinker, a very, very strong thinker of territorium. The contradiction or the opposition, the dualism of the city and the countryside is territorial. At least as in my perception, more interesting for the present and for the coming future is the island, the ocean. Otherwise we wouldn't understand, for example, Glissant, if we would not think the world differently as a shattered territorium, as a collection of islands. And when we go into the city places where most of the people live now, the megapolises, there is nothing like the Greek city anymore. There is a huge collection of islands in Singapore, in Tehran, or in Sao Paulo, or wherever we go. It has nothing to do with the classical structure of the city. So I wonder how you get these new realities of mondial existence into this concept, which in my opinion is pretty much territorial thinking.
There's a lot in what you've just said, Siegfried, but just as a sort of visualization of the limitations of my example, the city center area that I showed as the walled area of Athens is about equivalent in territory to an average car park at Heathrow Airport. So it's the trivial, in contemporary urban spaces, it's a trivial little pocket. But what you identify is, again, to quote another philosopher, one of the problems of the footnotes to Plato. And Kant, as you say, was the great thinker about cosmopolitanism, but he was the great normative thinker of cosmopolitanism. In a sense, he is the point of departure for Heidegger and for Sloterdijk, because he embodies how the idea that with good humanist thinking, with good moral thinking, with good reasoned laws, one can cooperate and collaborate with strangers and define the terms of that cooperation and coexistence. But it presupposes that the role of philosophy, like in Plato, was to guide the people into good conduct. And by guiding the people into good conduct, it would tame the beast that's already inside them. So that does nothing to dispute the primacy of the idea that we are inherently beastly in nature. And what it does suggest is that the function of the academy, the university, the art school, everything, the humanism, is to, through directed study, read your Adorno properly and you will be a great critical thinker, etc., or whatever. By this guided conduct, you will come out a better person, better artist, better everything, right? Now, what Heidegger and Sloterdijk, I think, turn around and say is, that doesn't work. That's not enough. The beast inside us will not be tamed by humanism. And so what he proposes is a different kind of journey, a journey inside the vertical. And like you said, Kant never left home either. Some people also say that he was a virgin. So he not only never left the city, but he never, in a sense, left his own body. But the issue is more fundamental, I think, than these biographical facts of territory, culture, and body. The issue is also about whether there is a beast that is primary and can only be tamed by good conduct and good reading and good practice, or whether this beast is not primary, but in parallel and co-constitutive with what other people call the irenic or aesthetic forces. So my interest in cosmopolitanism is not to say that we need to revitalize a normative discourse so that by following good rules we become good citizens and therefore good world fellows, but rather by having a greater faith, which ultimately philosophy doesn't have, in our intersubjective behavior. If we have a faith that we are equal, radically equal, and equally capable of learning to become wise, right? Then if we have that greater faith, then that is the basis of the equilibrium for world fellowship. That is the basis of the affinities and the cooperations and collaborations. So it's not because we are guided into being good with each other, but we have an inherent capacity for curiosity, care, wonder, and desire, which is not necessarily destructive. It's also possibly equally constructive. And that faith in that capacity is what is obscured and blurred by metaphysics.
Irrgang, you were also lifting your hand.
I'm going to stand because I can't see you. I think maybe to think closely about conviviality and about the way in which it was explored, let's say, in the spaces of art, contemporary art, which I think is it's been a consistently interesting model, what's happened in the spaces of contemporary art, where I think, what is much too narrowly called the educational turn, which is a much larger social turn, a turn of sociability, which insisted that those spaces which had been for hundreds of years dedicated to looking, right, into a kind of subject-object set of relations, looking with great concentration, aimed at arriving at some form of edification, generally speaking, are turned into, there's a turning away from the object and a turning towards a set of exchanges between subjects and a reanimation of that space. But I think that for me there's sort of two questions of what you put forward. One is that conviviality doesn't accrue.
Doesn't?
Accrue.
Accrue.
There's no sedimentation of conviviality. So if we look at all kinds of rather too maybe dramatic, but for the sake of a question, if we look at sort of certain moments, fascist Germany, Israel, Palestine, Yugoslavia in the 90s, etc., what we see is that there's no accretion of conviviality. It sort of disappears under certain kinds of pressures. What I'm sort of wondering about is, how do you envisage a kind of concrete actualization of the kind of conviviality that is explored these days in the spaces of culture as we turn away from objects and begin a kind of intersubjective set of exchanges? Because that original conviviality was, in a way, I don't know what term to use, not oppositional, but it certainly worked against something. It worked against an edict that one had to stare at art in order to be edified.
Yeah.
Right? And one of the things we said was, we can talk to one another, we can exchange ideas, we can learn together, we can explore together, and that's a whole other form of edification. So there was a real politics there that was, in opposition to all kinds of things that we don't really need to name. So it's the sort of if conviviality is not harnessed to a political project, how can we think of some process by which it accrues, by which it kind of sediments and can be passed on?
Can be?
Passed on.
Yes, that's really, again, a very rich and beautiful set of observations and comments. And what I suspect you're saying is there a politics of conviviality? Is there a way of organizing it and transmitting it and transferring it? And that's a very, very interesting challenge. And I think L'Internationale is really struggling with this very question. But one thing I have learned through this conference, rather something that's become very clear to me, is also how conviviality is connected to the modes of spectatorship and the way knowledge occurs in these modes of spectatorship. On this weekend in Melbourne is the typical White Night Festival. 200,000 people will be walking up and down the city centre of Melbourne right now. It's midnight, but they're hanging out, they're gone there, and there's very few police. Hardly any, just for lost kids. It's not a place where, the mob is going to go out of control. That's one social question that's interesting. Another interesting question is they're all looking at projection and interactive and large-scale public art practices, which is, outside of a museum, the object is unfixed. No one sees the same thing twice. Very few people see the whole work to its completion. Many art historians and artists will tell you that this is a waste of money, that 200,000 people have an experience like this, because they're not having a hermeneutic experience. And let's just leave that bit of dismissal to the side, but we'll come back to it. I had this conversation with both you and Hans, and I'll share it now. What I've been very conscious in the course of this last 2 days is the modes of spectatorship and how the vocabulary for this mode of spectatorship needs radical updating. When someone in a different cosmology looked at an icon, they were not interpreters. They were in communion with that icon. By being devotees, being of the faith, when they looked at this manifestation of the divine, which is what an icon is, they were not analyzing it. They were being at one with it. That oneness was only possible because the subjectivity of that person is a fragment of the divine. In Hans's beautiful lecture, he talked about how with the invention of the vanishing point, the observer arrives. The observer arrives and analyzes, decodes, narrates, and interprets the work. But the observer also arrives at the age of enlightenment and the age of modernity, whereby agency and circumstance are in dynamic interplay. You are not just a fragment of the divine and therefore preordained. You are a shaper of your destiny to an extent that the circumstances allow you to be. So your mode of spectatorship and your mode of agency are radically different from that of the devotee who communes because he is a fragment of the divine, or she. Now we have the third revolution in subjectivity. 200,000 people walking up and down a city are not wasting public money, in my view. They are, in fact, having a new kind of experience, a new kind of way of associating and assembling cultural, aesthetic, social knowledge through the combination of different bits of information and through a kind of ambient awareness of both the aesthetic, the social, the political, etc. Now, this experience that happens when art is in a public space, when you're in an immersive environment like the ones Geoffrey Shaw masterfully creates, is a very complex process of feedback. And we don't talk about people in these environments as being observers. Many people use the word participant, which in a sense I'm a little bit uncomfortable with, but nevertheless it highlights a different level of agency, not equivalent to the agency of modernity, but an agency of manipulation through the fragmentation and multiplicity and overstimulation that occurs in these complex environments. So to come back to Siegfried's point about an urban landscape and how rich and complex it is, it reveals to us that no one can be coherent. You know, when I showed that first slide of the Agora, I showed you all the features of urban life. They're all within the equivalent of a car park space at Heathrow. You see places of leisure, places of commerce, places of devotion, places of education, places of illumination, places of there were places where the prostitutes were. All this within a 15 to 20 minute walk of each other. Now, this occurs in every city. Nothing new actually has been added in our urban vocabulary. But it's dispersed, fragmented in the multiple villages that we live now. And sometimes we have to go significant distances to experience the sum of what was available at one point in time in a very discrete and concrete space.
Ludmila.
My question would probably continue somehow. Now I hope it's possible to hear me, or it's the same echo. So it would be, in a certain respect, a continuation of the previous questions, also about like politics of conviviality. I would rather switch my attention to these two models, like model of academia and peripatetic Stoic model. And I would like to ask, do you see, on one hand, the potential of, let's say, peripatetic model to produce its own normativity? And on the other hand, also, is there any ways to somehow prevent it, to production of its own normativity within peripatetic modes of education, on one hand, and also, like in the next step, also the implication of it, do we have a chance somehow save audience from becoming a prosumer?
Yep. That's a very good point as well. It's to do with hierarchy. The peripatetic model the Stoic model has a very different relationship to hierarchy. As I tried to explain, the academy was hierarchical enchantment. It was vertical. You know, the head and the lector, let alone the outsider, were in a hierarchical relationship. If you're walking up and down the Stoa, you're constantly encountering everybody else. You're being interrupted. And so the fascinating thing is how that knowledge organizes itself in this moment of parade. And I think the interesting thing is that a normativity is inherent as well. It's not just the aesthetic moment. The aesthetic moment produces its own normativeness. That's why I also said that the institutional critique was a normative realignment of the museum. Right? The institutional critique, there's not enough women, there's not enough blacks, there's not enough this, there's not enough that, is a normative realignment, as well as an aesthetic intervention. And similarly, what I'm suggesting, that in a way, the academy today is, in a sense, a continuation of the Platonic, but an opportunity to create a liminal space as well. And this is not new. That we want to have arcades in our academy. We want our students to do the situationist interventions. We want the relationship between the inside and the outside to explode and implode and reconfigure itself. And this thing can be done in a non-hierarchical manner and then re-establish itself anew each time. And if we have faith in our capacity to do both things, to have the aesthetic and the normative inside each other, then it isn't a question of the normative guiding the aesthetic and controlling it, but rather than being in constant coexistent and co-constitutive relation to each other.
Andreas,
yeah, it's going to be.
But we'll have a short lunch.
Thank you very much for this talk. It's been illuminating, inspiring. I have two images in my mind, like the beginning of the talk, the screening of Kamal's film. We have seen this city that is destroyed by several complex historical problems. Of course, we are missing the structure that was hidden in that city, right? On the contrary, in your presentation, we had this exploration beautifully explained about the polis, right? And the constitution of every space and how it was related to knowledge, love, conviviality. So my question is, how can we as artists, academics, be prepared for the conviviality of these two things, like worlds that eventually are disappearing violently from the world, the traditions embedded in that, in those spaces, and eventually, like the tools that we have that connects us, for instance, with the Greek world, right? That is, of course, is the space that Plato used to teach the academia, right? But we can naturally see that because we have the alphabet. We have the alphabet, many of the, the knowledge that is embedded in our heads. It's a direct connection to interpret and look at with some familiarity to these spaces. So.
Yeah, in a sense, the disappearance of knowledge is profound, and the inaccessibility of lots of cultural knowledge is colossal. I come from Australia, where indigenous knowledge is such a slender feature in our everyday life, and so the capacity for us to even imagine the past the Aboriginal past is really, really thin. Before we begin any public event now in Australia, we are obliged, and many people willingly do this, and some people do it quite cynically, and some people try to avoid it, but everyone is obliged, not compelled, obliged, to make an acknowledgement to the ancestors of the indigenous people of the place that you're in. And you have to name them, name the country from which. And every time I hear this, I can't imagine what it means. It's a kind of empty ritual. But slowly I've noticed that some people do this with a little bit more passion, a little bit more imagination. And slowly I've also noticed that Indigenous people are excavating bits of information and using this ritual to construct a very slender fabric from which we can hold and scaffold our own capacities. So at one stage there was a question whether we should ignore this ritual because it was pointless and that it was empty and that it could be cynically abused. I insist that we should repeat it until it becomes real. It might not be real yet for me. I want it to become real, and through the repetition, there might be an accretion. And thereby, maybe for my daughter's generation, it will have a resonance and a texture that is graspable. And so I think sometimes we have to keep with this faith that by just doing something, something else will come. And I'm also thinking of the example of Jacques Rancière's book of the Ignorant Master, the book, where he describes the example of this 19th century Jacques Cousteau, who could teach people without knowing. And that idea of teaching without knowing and equivalence of intelligence is an incredibly powerful affirmation of the creative potential of people. And that's what we should be doing in art schools.
Thank you very much for your contribution. So now, as yesterday, we can have lunch, and I think that there'll be many further discussions of what we just heard, also in relation to what we discussed yesterday, and also in relation to artistic practices. Thank you again. We'll meet here again at
2:30. And I just wanted to add that, of course, all the participants of the conference are invited for lunch in the cafeteria downstairs. Let me just thank Anja Dorn very much for navigating us through this morning, which was wonderfully a little bit chaotic with the telecommunication presence from Beirut and the wonderful material from Kamal and the great lecture by Nikos. I just would like to address one person whom I don't see at the moment, perhaps he disappeared already, who is part of the conference at least yesterday. His name is Yuk Hui. Perhaps some of them some of you talked to him. Yukui just published a wonderful book which is called Cosmotechnology. And it's an investigation on deep time in China, and a very, very special discussion of something which ends in his thesis in the fleeing point of what he calls interobjectivity. So Yukui is already far away from our discussion, and he starts at a different point there where the objects are having dialogue with each other. Kamal's film somehow is also picking this idea up. Objects are talking to each other, of course. The mediator is still between the artist and is organizing the dialogue. But one of the theses in Yukui's work is that we are already beyond this necessity, and objects can talk to each other and have the dialogue. I wish you a good lunch, and we meet again in the afternoon.